This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, of course, emerging market equities climbed today, and that, of course, is after U.S. President Joe Biden's nominee for Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, did urge the government to act big on spending. Now, as a result, MSCI's index of emerging market stocks rose 1% to record highs today. On the continent, the JSE All-Share Index followed suit. It climbed almost 1% on the day. Now, also, December inflation numbers from the country came in steady. In Egypt, the EGX 30 continues to climb. Top gainers were Commercial International Bank, which is Egypt's largest private bank. It gained about 1.2% on the day. And of course, tobacco firm Eastern Company climbed 1.4% on the day. Now, also coming up on today's show, Joe Biden is sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. Foreign investment into China hits record highs in 2020. And game hunting for sport gets a boost in Tanzania. Well, our starting point on tonight's show is the United States, where Joe Biden has been sworn in as the 46th president of the country. He comes in amid a devastating global pandemic and the threat of a possible domestic terrorism. Now, Kamala Harris has also been sworn in as the vice president, becoming the first woman, the first African American, and the first Asian American to serve in the role. Here's what Joe Biden had to say during his first speech as the president of America.
This is America's day. This is democracy's day. A day of history and hope, of renewal and resolve. Through a crucible for the ages, America has been tested anew, and America has risen to the challenge. Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause, the cause of democracy. The people, the will of the people has been heard, and the will of the people has been heeded. We've learned again that democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile. And at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed. So now, on this hallowed ground where just a few days ago, violence sought to shake the Capitol's very foundation, we come together as one nation, under God, indivisible, to carry out the peaceful transfer of power as we have for more than 2 centuries. As we look ahead in our uniquely American way, restless, bold, optimistic, and set our sights on the nation we know we can be and we must be.
Now, of course, former President Donald Trump had pulled out of a number of global deals while he was in office. He favored a unilateralist approach, while his successor, Joe Biden, on the other hand, says America's standing on the world stage has diminished, and he vows to play a bigger part. CGTN's William Danslow looks at the task Biden faces.
On his first day in office, Joe Biden has pledged to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord and hold a climate summit within the first 100 days of his presidency. This marks a stark departure from his predecessor Donald Trump, who pulled the US out of the 2015 agreement on grounds that it put America at a disadvantage in global trade. President Trump's preference for unilateralism over multilateralism has played out frequently at the United Nations over the past several years. The Trump administration has pulled out of several UN agencies, including the World Health Organization and UNESCO. Joe Biden has vowed to rejoin the WHO and for the US to once again play a leading role in global diplomacy. As vice president in the Obama administration, the US negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. the trade deal between the US and 11 other nations that would have covered roughly 40% of the global economy. But Congress didn't sign off on it, and President Trump pulled out of the agreement in 2017. Analysts believe a Biden administration might struggle getting lawmakers to agree rejoining the TPP. It remains unclear how the Biden administration's approach to trade will differ from that of his predecessor, but it's likely decisions will be made more in concert with US allies, a marked change from President Trump's tendency to go it alone. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
Now, Donald Trump's presidency has been a roller coaster ride of ups and downs, lots of controversies and victories as well. CGTN's Timothy Ulrich takes a look at the legacy he'll be leaving behind.
Trump's White House has faced challenges from day one. The pandemic, the economic fallout, and violent protests, just to name a few. His culpability in these crises will be what historians study for generations to come. One example of this is the rise of right-wing violence. Just over a year into his term, far-right groups clashed with counter-protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia. Neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other far-right groups converged on the city in August 2017. Many wore red Trump hats, showing their support for the president. His initial response to the violence was to blame everyone equally.
You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent.
That caused a major backlash from the public and media, and he later issued a stronger response. Critics also blame the president and his rhetoric for emboldening groups like white supremacists. President Trump's last year in office saw another surge in violent protests. The killing of George Floyd, a black man, by Minneapolis police sparked demonstrations across the country. There were weeks of violence, ebbing and flowing with new instances of police killings. There are some challenges that arose during Trump's term that would be difficult no matter who was in the White House. The coronavirus outbreak, to name one. Infections and deaths soared in his final year. The healthcare system was stretched to its limits, and unemployment rates reached record highs. Months into the pandemic, veteran White House journalist Bob Woodward revealed Trump knew the dangers of the coronavirus early on. Woodward released audio from a call he had with Trump in February.
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
President Trump defended the call by saying he wanted to keep the economy afloat. Foreign policy was where the Trump administration claimed many victories. These include becoming the first U.S. president to step into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. While his meetings with DPRK leader Kim Jong-un may have not amounted to much on paper, it helped turn the page on relations between Washington and Pyongyang. But his foreign policy wasn't all wins. Trump pulled out of the Climate Paris Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and the World Health Organization in his term. He also started a trade war with China, putting a major strain on ties with Beijing. And President Trump brought the U.S. to the brink of war with Iran at the start of 2020. He ordered the killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani. The assassination infuriated the Islamic Republic, with Tehran vowing retaliation. The Trump administration faced its fair share of challenges, and the effects of his decisions are likely to be felt for a long time. In the very least, a legacy of its own of what a single-term president was able to achieve. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
And heading back to the continent now, here's a look at some corporate headlines today. The Nairobi Securities Exchange wants the government to cut its stake in key listed firms to as low as 10%. It is the latest bid to bring in new investors on the market. That's amid a lack of major listings in the last 5 years. Now, the NSE is pushing to increase additional shareholding in the next 6 months. It says the proposal made to the National Treasury will target companies such as Safaricom, KCB Group, and Kenya Reinsurance. Meanwhile, the government of Ghana has rejected plans by airline operator British Airways to change its London-Accra-London flight origination and termination points. This means that all British Airways flights will originate and terminate at Gatwick Airport instead of Heathrow. The new plan was to start in the forthcoming summer. The British Airways team is yet to provide further information to support its reasons for the changes. Meanwhile, mobile operator MTN and insurer Momentum Metropolitan Holdings are now looking to grow their micro-insurance joint venture in Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria as they seek to capitalize on African nations with low insurance penetration. Now, MTN has been keen to diversify its business in recent years. It is pursuing new revenue streams in mobile data, technology, and related communications services. Meanwhile, Heineken South Africa has announced that it will be cutting its workforce by 7% in order to mitigate the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent alcohol bans on its trade. The company will slash 70 jobs from its 1,000-person strong staff in an effort to restructure its operations. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's head into a quick break now, still coming up on the show. The COVID-19 economic impact is amongst top global threats. And South Africa's mining sector takes a knock due to fresh lockdown rules.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Uche Okoronkwo. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. Welcome back. Well, let's go back to our top story today. Joe Biden has been sworn in as the 46th president of the United States. He comes amid a devastating global pandemic and, of course, the threat of possible domestic terrorism in the country. Well, let's find out more from Nathan King. He joins us now in Washington. Always good to see you, Nathan. Welcome to the show. Now, of course, Biden did signal that from day one, we can expect to see a number of moves to reverse, of course, several decisions made by Trump. And, of course, an unwinding of the previous president's policies on issues such as immigration and climate change. What do you expect to see on day one, Nathan?
Yeah, there's a whole long list, and I think you're absolutely right to focus on immigration and climate change. On immigration, you remember in the first days of the Trump administration, they imposed a travel ban largely from Muslim countries. It was essentially called the Muslim travel ban on unwanted and unfounded theories of terrorism. Well, that's going to be revoked as of today. Now, there will also be an immigration bill very soon, which will give a pathway to citizenship for tens of millions of people in this country who are here without papers. And they could easily become citizens or green card holders within a few years, up to 8 years. So it's a total reversal. They're also going to try and get an immigration bill that doesn't focus on building a wall or security, but essentially focuses on making sure that people that are not documented are pay taxes, have health insurance or access to insurance, etc. Now, this will be a complete 180. Now, on climate change, you're absolutely right. From today, and we're going to be getting an announcement very soon, I understand, the Joe Biden administration will officially rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which, of course, was abandoned by Donald Trump. Now, what this will mean in terms of changing a policy, well, they're also going to focus domestically on incentivizing green energy production. He's also going to probably cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, which is going to brings gas from Canada, which has been a big problem for environmentalists and a back in political football for many years. So all this is going to happen on day one. There's also going to be more protections for the so-called dreamers. These were kids who were brought here when they were very young by parents who entered the country illegally. They have been protected by the Obama administration and the courts during the Trump administration, despite the best efforts of Republicans to actually remove their protections. So there will be a quicker pathway to citizenship for them as well. Now, of course, COVID is complicating things when it comes to just people coming into the country. In fact, the Trump administration in its last 24 hours said we're lifting travel restrictions from European Union, from Brazil, from elsewhere, other countries as well. And the Biden administration said, no, hang on a minute. We are changing our immigration policies, but we are still seeing rampaging COVID cases and deaths here, and we're seeing it across the world as well. We are not opening those borders on the 26th of January. So there's that as well. But also look for other things as well in terms of moving towards removing some of the restrictions allowances on emissions for companies in the US when it comes to polluting, and look at other elements of the immigration bill as well. There'll be lots more.
Now, there's certainly lots of changes on the table. After the Georgia election, we now see there'll be a 50-50 partisan split in the Senate, with Vice President Kamala Harris giving some control to the Democrats. Is it likely that we'll see Biden facing a lot of opposition or much opposition to his policies going forward?
So can you repeat that?
Is it likely that we'll see Biden facing much opposition to his cabinet and, of course, his policies going forward? Well, it certainly looks like we've lost Nathan there. We'll try and get him back for more of an update on today's inauguration. Well, let's turn our attention in the meantime to another story, economic and social fallout from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Those are amongst the top global threats. That's according to the latest report by the World Economic Forum. The 16th Global Risk Report found that mass unemployment, digital inequality, and prolonged economic stagnation were some of the risks that could pose a danger in the next 2 years. It also noted that young adults are experiencing their second major global crisis in a decade, having lived through the disruption of the financial crisis and the economic inequality it sparked. Now, climate change remained amongst the top long-term concerns. The report, of course, is based based on a survey of over 800 people, part of WEF's stakeholder communities, including business, academia, government, and NGOs. Earlier, CGTN's Juliet Mann talked with Sadia Zahidi, the managing director of the World Economic Forum, on more of that global risk report. Take a listen.
Thanks ever so much for joining us. So we're talking about COVID amplifying those social and those economic issues. But what does your risk report tell us that we didn't already know?
I think what's happened with the pandemic is that the social fractures that already existed, the economic inequality that already existed, that has been supercharged. At the same time, the fourth industrial revolution and the use of digital technologies has also accelerated. And so you're starting to see this perfect storm where not only is there a health crisis, but you're starting to see some of that social cohesion disappearing. You're starting to see many more fractures, much more inequality than before. And that then will be an impediment to the other big issue that we have to deal with globally. As you mentioned, the big existential risk in 5 to 10 years out is still climate change. And if we don't have the social cohesion that leads to global cooperation, that's not a challenge that we're going to be able to address. So I think what the report does is heighten the sense of urgency and tell us how much faster some of these things, some of these challenges are coming.
You mentioned that big existential crisis in the longer term, but what about the medium term? What are the knock-on effects of those risks going to be?
So on the one hand, it was absolutely critical that governments do the kind of spending they have done to provide short-term support to economies, to ensure that households are supported, to ensure that as many jobs as possible are being preserved. And at the same time, that may create in the long term the possible risk of debt crisis. So that's the kind of knock-on effect that we can see may come in a few years' time. This doesn't mean that this is a prediction. What this is trying to raise the concern about some of the risks. Now, if governments do put in place the right kinds of investments, they ensure that this is not just about the shorter term emergency measures, but some of the right investments are being put in place to recreate the kind of inclusive and sustainable growth we need, then we should be able to mitigate the effects of some of these potential future risks.
Well, let's now turn our attention to infrastructure investment in emerging markets. An IFC report says that supporting low-carbon investments through COVID-19 recovery, targeting funding for 10 key sectors across 21 emerging markets, has the potential to generate about $10.2 trillion in investment opportunities. Now, the report further says that funding will create about 213 million jobs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 4 billion tons by 2030. The IFC also found that rebuilding emerging and developing economies today to be greener tomorrow can not only drive economic recovery from COVID-19, but also help diminish the disproportionate impact of climate change on the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. Well, let's discuss infrastructural investment in Africa and what it'll look like post-COVID further. We're joined by Tariq Badegesin. She is the MD and CIO at ARM Harith Infrastructure Investment. Great to have you on the show with us today. Well, let's talk about the future of infrastructural investment on the continent post-COVID. Experts do say that Africa's infrastructure finance gap, that is likely to widen due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as a player in the sector, how exactly have you seen fund investments challenged by this pandemic? Have we seen the crisis heavily impact the business of financing and, of course, developing infrastructure on the continent?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And indeed, the pandemic has been really significant for the infrastructure sector in a few respects, some negative and some positive. Large-scale infrastructure that we're all familiar with, because, large power plants or government-backed projects have come under strain because governments are under strain with respect to their fiscal balances, in that they don't have enough revenue to back their obligations, and they do make obligations into large-scale infrastructure. And so one of the fallouts of the pandemic has been governments potentially seeking to renegotiate certain obligations that they made as they look to rebalance their economies and their balance sheets and their obligations. Also, as governments have to borrow more to cover these additional expenses and unforeseen obligations, they're unwilling to further make obligations to large-scale infrastructure. And so what that means is that while infrastructure in the typical sense that governments back obligations of government off-takers, if you will, those projects change, or they change character, and we have less of them. But what you do have is governments being a lot more willing to create enabling policies for the private sector to invest. And so what we're actually seeing is governments positioning to make much needed changes to policies that they may have felt they didn't have the right political environment to be able to enact some of those really difficult policies that might have been negative politically. You find governments are more willing to do that right now so that they can attract private capital into areas that they may not actually be able to borrow to fund. And so we're seeing some positives in that space as well. Broadly though, because infrastructure makes up what's called essential services, so the areas of power, telecommunications, ports and logistics, what we see is that a lot of those projects remain resilient. And insofar as they meet latent demand or a great gap, the projects remain commercially viable. Many of those projects, while they may have had a brief slowdown during the very initial months of the pandemic, many of those companies are coming back and they're functioning, and many of those projects continue to see interest. But what we are also seeing is a move to more what we're calling private infrastructure, which is projects that are a bit smaller. They have more of a commercial and industrial character to them. Some element of what we're calling distributed energy, where projects are, smaller for companies or using solar energy or distributed energy. And effectively, this is the alternative to large-scale infrastructure backed by governments when you have an economic slowdown.
Right. Now, of course, your focus has been mainly in energy solutions and climate-conscious investments. Given these enabling policies we're seeing now in private infrastructural investment, what is your investment strategy in these particular sectors going forward?
Well, indeed, we have to rethink how infrastructure is going to be financed, at least in the next 2 years, while the economies are still reeling from this experience. And we are looking at distributed energy. We're looking at private infrastructure projects. We're thinking about how to scale capital into mid-sized projects and what that implies for how we allocate capital. But also, we're looking at nodes of key activity. And so one of the areas that we're looking at is basically urbanization. One of our focus areas is really how we can support the development of urban infrastructure. West Africa, for example, is one of the most urban regions in Africa. Many of the cities in West Africa make up to 20 to 30% of the nation's GDP. And so we're basically looking at how we can access nodes of economic activity, nodes of infrastructure solutions that remain resilient even in a depressed or restrained economic context.
Now, of course, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it kicked off this year. In light of this, how do you see competition for deals in Africa's infrastructure space evolving going forward? And of course, you talked about private infrastructural investment. Looking at the overall sector, do you think we'll see sources of funding for infrastructure evolving, new pools of capital, more institutional capital, a focus on new sectors? What are your expectations?
Sure. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to be transformational for the continent in its ability to aggregate markets and to build out markets. But clearly, to be able to achieve the value from that agreement, we're going to need infrastructure, be it ports, roads, rail, that actually integrate those economies. And instead of it making for competition, it's actually going to require a great deal of collaboration across pools of capital, public, private, as well as cross-border engagement. And so there's going to be a lot of work to do, and even beyond physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure such as payment infrastructure, networks and telecommunications that will actually enable cross-border activity is also going to be very fundamental. So it's going to open up great opportunities, great investment opportunities, and also great returns, because with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the markets that should be able to enable the bankability and the commercial viability of this infrastructure should be in place, especially if we can actually achieve the economic integration through the payments and the systems, etc. To your point about capital and new sources of capital, even before the pandemic, there was an evolution of how infrastructure was being financed, and lots of very interesting innovations with respect to blended finance, for example, which is the integration of different forms of capital to form a unique solution. So we have more forms of capital that come together where concessionary capital works with private capital, works with guarantees, to actually create an instrument that would mobilize capital from institutional investors in international markets, for example. And so there have been some very successful cases of mobilizing capital from international institutional investors using development finance institutions such as the African Trade Insurance Agency, for example. And so you're seeing a lot of very interesting structures that are being used to blend finance to be able to mobilize capital. Right. Another key area is local currency. We do need to mobilize more local currency, and you're having a lot of thinkers and a lot of solution institutions that are providing enhancements and encouragement to opening up local pension funds, access to infrastructure, and helping to really attract that type of capital into infrastructure. And so I'm expecting to see a lot more of that. Right. And we're really trying to encourage governments and DFIs to see that as a very credible pool. And then, of course, there's going to be purpose-driven capital. So this would be capital that's interested in supporting a low-carbon future with respect to climate, the green recovery, and, of course, COVID resilience.
Quite an insightful conversation. We do have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us on the show today and for your insights. That, of course, is Tarieg Badegesin. She's the MD and CIO at ARM Harith Infrastructure Investment. Well, let's move on now. Due to renewed lockdown regulations in key trading partner countries, South Africa's mining production took a nosedive in November as it dropped by about 11.6% year on year. Now, the decline is mainly attributable to iron ore production, which plunged about 35.3%. Platinum Group metal production was also down 16.1% year on year. Here's Angelo Coppola with more.
New operational procedures due to COVID and uncertain electricity supply are key challenges.
Of course, electricity always in the background, and thirdly, probably more important than the second one is the logistical problems. We still have rail issues, we have harbor issues. If you look at iron ore production is low, but iron ore exports is also low, also declined. And border problems at Lubombo is actually not being resolved.
On a broader level, there are other challenges with severe consequences.
So I think lockdowns, both domestically and abroad, will likely hamper any meaningful recovery in the sector, particularly in the short to medium term. I think furthermore, if the recent bouts of load shedding that we've recently seen are not addressed, then the longer term prospects for the industry remain dim, as business confidence will remain low and obviously investments muted.
The saving grace for the sector in November were the prices of certain resources, excluding iron ore.
The better prices have given some breathing space for turnover and profitability probably, and time to adjust. But the adjustment is difficult. There's no doubt about it.
COVID-19 has played a massive role in disrupting mining operations, but the battle is being fought.
Certainly operational adjustments that are happening at the mines, which is an issue, and it's a continuation of what happened last year. And I've heard some of the CEOs saying, we know what to do, we just continue to do it. And but production is slower. If you look at the pattern of production, it dipped, of course, quite severely and then recovered by about 40% in the third quarter.
The South African mining industry remains a critical component of South Africa's economic recovery.
hopefully it will continue to grow from strength to strength.
It's extremely important. So firstly, about 400,000 people are employed in the sector, and there's a lot of crucial value chain linkages with the mining sector. So the sector actually, pardon the pun, is the bedrock of the overall economy.
If prices stay where they are, and there's no reason to think that they won't stay where they are, the world economy, the forecast will be slightly lower, quoting the World Bank, but the demand is there.
I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
You're watching Global Business Africa. We're going to take a short break now. Still coming up on the show. Foreign investment into China hits record high in 2020. And the U.S. state of Florida is battling what it calls vaccine tourism. Stay tuned for what that means exactly after the short break.
No one again began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time now. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back. Now, China's actual use of foreign direct investment is at record levels. Data from the Ministry of Commerce out on Wednesday do suggest that the Chinese market has lost none of its attraction. Here's CGTN's Gao Ang with more.
Chinese government data says the country's actual use of foreign investment hit a record high of nearly 1 trillion yuan in 2020, up 6.2% year on year. That's about $144 billion. China also established over 38,000 new enterprises with foreign investment throughout the year.
China further optimized the structure for foreign investment in 2020. The service sector actually used foreign investment of over 776 billion yuan last year, accounting for over 77% of the country's total use of foreign investment.
Foreign investment attracted by China's high-tech industries in 2020 grew by over 11% year-on-year. In response to the pandemic, the government has also rolled out multiple policies to support foreign investors, part of efforts to get work and production up and running again. The Chinese government says it has also provided these enterprises with medical supplies and helped 16,000 foreign employees enter the country.
According to a recent survey by the Ministry of Commerce, nearly 60% of foreign invested enterprises achieved growth or remained the same in terms of income and profits for their operations in 2020, and nearly 90% were optimistic or cautiously optimistic about their future prospects.
Official data shows foreign invested enterprises account for 2% of the total number of enterprises in China. But the foreign invested enterprises provide 1/10 of the jobs in urban areas and 1/6 in tax revenue. Despite uncertainties brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, China has been striving for high-quality opening up through optimizing the structure of foreign investment as well as improving the environment for it. CGTN, Beijing.
Meanwhile, global oil body OPEC says it is cautiously optimistic about the oil market recovering in 2021. Now, members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and a group of its allies had made some deep cuts in production last year in order to help support prices as the coronavirus pandemic reduced demand for fuel.
What happened recently was the projections for 2021, in particular, the first quarter that we are in now, being a traditionally low demand season, which had the potential of a major disequilibrium in the supply and demand balances, we now decided to temper the restoration of supplies as earlier planned. And we, although brought back about 425,000 barrels a day, our biggest producer took it upon itself to continue to provide the leadership that they had always provided, so that we do not allow this disequilibrium and the building up of stocks to materialize.
From our point of view, we think that the oil demand will not, even in the absence of major policy changes in the governments, will not grow as much as we have seen in the past. We rather expect around 5-6 years of time after this rebound, after the crisis, the oil demand being rather flat. And this, once again, as we said several times, brings an urgent message to many governments around the world, namely diversification of their economies.
Well, let's head back to the U.S. now. Now, shortly after Joe Biden was inaugurated as the new U.S. president, he's accepting gifts from the leaders of the U.S. Congress. Let's take a listen.
I have the privilege of giving the flag to the President of the United States, the flag that was flown when you were sworn in, Mr. President. This flag reflects all that is said about your inauguration. America united. May it be a symbol of the hope, the healing, and the just all of the enthusiasm that you have for our country. And as we heard the beautiful national anthem, when we're at the stadium and they say, is our flag still there? Then you say, play ball, right there, play ball. So we're going to get ready to play ball. We're ready to go with the inspiration of our flag flying. But again, on behalf of the House of Representatives, it is my privilege to extend to you the flag that was flown the early moment that you were sworn in as President of the United States. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Dr. Biden. Thank you. If we had the lunch, we would have had California wine. Is that not right? Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, congratulations. With liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Of course, Joe Biden hearing from Nancy Pelosi there. Well, let's shift focus now. Take a look at commodity markets today. Oil prices soaring again, of course, building on solid gains overnight. And that is thanks to a combination of a weaker dollar and the expectation that the incoming U.S. administration will deliver huge stimulus spending that will help lift fuel demand and draw down crude stocks. Meanwhile, gold prices also up today. Of course, gold's appeal as an inflation hedge was bolstered by the expectation for U.S. stimulus as well. Let's take a quick break now, still coming up. Game hunting for sport gets a boost in Tanzania.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Syria,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
And let's head to Tanzania now, where the government plans to auction 30 hunting blocks next month, and that's after postponing the exercise for almost a year. The Tanzanian Wildlife Management Authority has invited applications through e-auctioning. Back in June 2019, the government did place about 26 hunting blocks on an online auctioning platform in order to mark the beginning of a major transition towards game hunting for sport. Here's CGTN's Daniel Kijo reporting.
Tanzania might be the king of the jungle in Africa's trophy hunting sector. Since the official start of trophy hunting in 1891 under German rule, the country has generated millions of dollars globally. It has 23 game reserves and 126 hunting blocks. Each block ranges from 200 to 3,000 square kilometers. Now, using an electronic auctioning system, it is inviting local and international hunting companies to bid for 30 vacant hunting blocks. A system the Tanzanian wildlife officials say is free from corruption and is transparent.
So we think instead of administrative allocating this hunting block, where maybe somebody will be biased to decide who to get what, we have decided automatic electronic auction will be very fair and very transparent.
Last year, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism had postponed electronic auctioning of the vacant hunting blocks due to complaints from some stakeholders, as well as market instability caused by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. With less than a month before the auction, the Tanzanian Tourism Board says the auction can grow new markets.
Right now, we're trying to focus in promoting hunting tourism to other Far East and Russia markets, and it's paying off right now. When a hunter comes to Tanzania, they bring in between $20,000 to $30,000 compared to a normal tourist who comes on leisure, who can bring in between $2,000 to $3,000. So you can see the dynamics that it's a market that we need to tap on.
The government has maintained that trophy hunting is one of the sustainable ways of managing wildlife, as it provides much needed funding for conservation efforts. It also says it operates in compliance with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the world's leading authority on the status of the natural world and measures needed to safeguard it.
Other species which are under IUCN category are not listed as endangered species are allowed to be hunted. So apart from abiding to the international regulation of conservation status of this wildlife species, the animals which can be utilized and are agreed in internationally, all these animals are hunted.
The U.S. is Tanzania's biggest market for big game hunting. According to Tower, Tanzania alone accounts to nearly 60% of all U.S. imports of hunting trophies from Africa. The U.S. government lifted the ban on the importation of lion and elephant hunting trophies from Tanzania under case-by-case consideration in 2019. This has prompted fresh interest in trophy hunting as a subsector of tourism. As it stands, the government says it allows hunting of 18 to 24% of all animals in the annual hunting quota. They now want to use this e-auctioning system to increase the utilization of these wildlife resources so as to increase revenue while still protecting the species for generations to come. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
Now, Florida is one of the first states in the U.S. to expand its COVID-19 vaccination program to anyone 65 years or older. Demand far outpaces supply, and millions of older residents are still waiting their turn. But as Nitsa Soledad Perez now reports, there is no residency requirements for the shots, and that has prompted what's being called vaccine tourism, which is causing an uproar from Florida's residents.
This Argentine television personality came to visit Miami and got her mother vaccinated against the coronavirus. Janina La Torre posted about her experience on Instagram and even called a local show in her home country to encourage others to do the same.
They don't ask for anything, just the passport, and I tell all Argentines that have the possibility to go to Miami, they just ask for your name, last name, and date of birth. When they ask for an American ID, just enter 999.
And she's not the only one. Other wealthy Argentines and South American tourists have come to Miami to get COVID-19 vaccinations, generating a controversy over foreigners getting ahead of Americans in line. Argentine Anna Rosenfeld, a celebrity lawyer, also got the shot on a trip to Florida and says she's done nothing wrong.
I do want to clarify, because if 1, 2, or 3 Argentines have been vaccinated, it doesn't mean that the American people or Florida residents will not have that possibility. We are not taking that chance for anyone.
Floridians would disagree. They see the state's own seniors being turned away from sites as doses run out. It happened at another site Monday.
We don't want to deny them the vaccines, but charity begins at home.
Tourists don't see it that way.
I'm from Argentina. My sister lives here. We've been here for 1 month. We're leaving on Friday. We came to visit on holidays. I think it's okay. Health must be worldwide. If you're here traveling in this country and you have the opportunity to take the vacuum is the English for, I think it's okay.
Paul Bonafero is a Canadian who typically spends winters in Florida, called a snowbird here.
I understand that some people, Canadians that are here that are 65 years of age and over, are already getting vaccinated. Unfortunately, I'm not that old yet, but as soon as I'm eligible here, I would do it, or if not, when I go back home to Canada.
The governor tried to quell the uproar.
We're not doing any tourists. You know, some of these nursing home people may live here 6 months of the year, so that's a little bit different. But we're not. We have people all over the country because we put seniors first, and because people actually see shots going in arms. You have literally people all over the world and all over the country calling here to see, and we're not doing that. We're not doing it for tourists. We're not doing it for interlopers.
But it's still happening because federal guidelines bar residency restrictions. And what it all means is that anyone 65 and older can come to Florida and get vaccinated. And that includes tourists, much to the dismay and resentment of the state's local population. Mitza Soledad Perez, CGTN, Miami.
Well, before we leave you today, here's a look at Africa's currencies and a quick look at South Africa's rand. It led gains across emerging market currencies as, of course, domestic inflation numbers in the country remained steady. It rose about 0.6% and it was set for a third day of gains as it marked a steady recovery from losses which we saw last week. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.